You're listening to Arcane Carolinas, an exploration of the Carolinas' folklore, legends, myths, and modern weird. Each episode, we examine the historical context of our topic and aim to preserve some of the stories that help make this part of the world such a fascinating place. Hello and welcome to Arcane Carolinas. I'm being weird because I'm trying not to make a bunch of noise. I'm your co-host, Charlie Mushaw.
I'm your co-host, award-winning novelist Michael G. Williams. Oh my goodness.
And I don't know. Sometimes the goal is just to get a reaction out of you. So,
well, you succeeded. I didn't want to laugh really loudly when you did that because I was like, that's not nice. People are going to be turning up their volume. But I did find that very funny.
So, welcome once again to a part of our fall 2021 smorgasbord of episodes in which we traverse the Carolinas exploring the myths, folklore, and modern weird. Thank you to our Patreons specifically for helping us pick these topics. Without their input, we would be a rudderless ship. That's a gross exaggeration, but we do really appreciate the input. If you enjoy our show, please consider giving us a like or rating or review on the app that you use to listen to us.
Indeed. So that we will not just be adrift on the sea of information and feedback. I don't know. I'm doing a bad job with that metaphor.
This metaphor is crap.
I want Dr. Zoidberg yelling, your metaphor is bad and you should feel bad at me personally.
Oh, we do have news. And again, we are recording this long before you will hear it. However, we have picked a date for the spooky season live stream, and not knowing when this episode specifically will air, I'm just going to say that we're targeting Wednesday, October 6th.
Yeah, totally. Thank you for remembering that.
And if this happens to get published after that date, it will be recorded for your review on our YouTube channel, because we're going to try to do some stuff with that channel because we've, like our Twitter, we've neglected it.
Well, you can't do everything.
Nah, we're active on Facebook and Instagram, so that's the best way to get a hold of us and see behind the scenes stuff. I'm going to stop yakking because it's your turn to drive.
Okay. We're going to talk about the ghost hound of Goshen Hill, South Carolina.
I did not know the hill part.
Yes. So it turns out there's a town in South Carolina called Goshen that's near Charleston. It's not that. Okay. Goshen Hill is a tiny, tiny community. It is referred to in official documents as a populated place.
A place to be.
Right. It's not unlike my own hometown in that regard. And
that sounds like something from Parks and Rec.
It does, doesn't it? Like there's city, town, township, neighborhood, and populated place.
Any place can be a populated place if you believe.
Right. Or if there's a living person there. I started to say a body, and then I realized, okay, they don't really count as populations. But Goshen Hill is in Union County, South Carolina. And that is the location for this story, but I'm actually going to start in the upper Midwest.
Ooh.
Whenever we do these, we always like to talk a little about the indigenous populations that lived in these places before settlers from Europe arrived. So I want to talk a little about the Erie. They were an Iroquoian indigenous people located on the southern shore of Lake Erie in modern-day western New York and northwestern Pennsylvania, northern Ohio, that kind of region.
Rust Belt, I believe, is part of what they call that, right?
Yes, absolutely. So if you've ever been to Rochester, New York, that's an area where the Erie lived. To make an exceptionally long story short, the Erie lost a lengthy war with the Iroquois themselves and splintered into several smaller groups. And one of these were the Westo people, who migrated south to Virginia in the 1600s.
Sorry, I'm laughing at the fact that, so they just decided to turn into a bunch of different tribes?
They take a post-apocalyptic story, think of a post-apocalyptic science fiction story in which the United States crumbles into 50 or 60 different splinter groups.
Okay.
That's what happened to the Erie.
Okay. I don't think I've had enough coffee today because in my mind, I'm like, I wasn't visualizing the size and scope appropriately. And I was just picturing like the textbook version of a tribe, which is like this small group of people living in a village. And then they like individually all went their separate ways, which is just a testament to the fact that I haven't had enough coffee to think critically yet. So
no, that's not what happened.
Okay.
This was a large people. They were a nation, and they lost this war against the Iroquois, and they splintered into a bunch of different smaller groups. And one of those, the Westo people, migrated south to Virginia in the middle of the 17th century, maybe the early 17th century, just in time for European colonizers to arrive.
Great.
Yeah. Everything went fine.
We're new here. Hey, us too.
So the Westo, once they got to Virginia, promptly began trading with the colonists by raiding the neighboring tribes of indigenous peoples that already lived there, taking slaves, and then swapping them for colonists' guns.
I'm sure they were very popular.
That did not make them the best diplomats in the world.
How are the new neighbors? Don't go over there. Don't talk.
Right.
Don't make eye contact. Don't wave. Don't wave. Don't wave.
The new people are not okay. And like, it's easy to sort of paint them as villains by describing them in that really reductive way. But given the experience they just had of being driven from their own land to the north, I imagine they were a little less than eager to trust people, And I think that given that they had been nearly exterminated, they had plenty of reasons to look out for themselves and only themselves. So there's a lot of forces at work in their story. But pretty rapidly, Virginia got too crowded. So the Westo migrated south again to upstate and mid-modern day South Carolina, where they promptly began raiding the Cherokee, Catawba, and Cusabo tribes. Modern day Union County had previously been part of a large Cherokee-controlled hunting territory. There weren't actually a ton of Cherokee towns in that area because they sort of kept people out of it so that there would be a lot of wildlife there for them to hunt more easily. Think of it as sort of the Cherokee version of a national park.
Game lands.
Yeah, exactly. So the Westo set up shop there. They started taking slaves from other tribes, trading them to the colonists who by then had arrived in South Carolina for guns. And they started raiding Spanish settlements in modern day Georgia. The boundary between South Carolina and Georgia these days is mostly defined by the Savannah River. And just south of the Savannah River and along the Savannah River, there were Spanish colonies. And the Westo really did not like the Spanish and just repeatedly went after them to the point that they basically wrecked several Spanish missions in Georgia. When we hear the word mission, we think of a religious settlement. And like that was an element of it, but really it was more like the Spanish term for like the local government of a colony. So like a mission was kind of one part a monastery, but also one part just like a civic government. So anyway.
I've seen Zorro.
There you go. Yes. So they were so aggressive towards the Spanish that the government of the Spanish colony in Florida basically abandoned some of their missions and sent troops to form a protected border on the northern end of the Spanish holdings in Georgia just to keep the Westo out. This is how rough the Westo were making it for them. So when English and other European colonizers also migrated south to the Carolina colony from Virginia, like I said, the Westo kept doing their thing. They were trading enslaved people from other tribes.
I say, we'll take another one of those people you've captured, and please do keep fighting the Spanish.
Yeah, that was pretty much the attitude,
They would
take enslaved people from other tribes.
Yeah, have a gun. Have a gun. Hmm? Have two guns. Yeah, take two.
Exactly. They would take the colonial guns, and then they would go do more raids. And they signed treaties with the English colony in South Carolina such that they monopolized diplomatic and economic relations between the colonists and the indigenous peoples of the region.
Aren't those Westo just smashing good people?
So they created this diplomatic and economic bottleneck that they could control, and this made them even more popular with everyone else, as you can imagine.
Hey, so you want some of those guns, eh? Eh? Maybe you need to pay a little protection.
Exactly. So now that we've established that there was a Native American mob, the Westo, much like other tribes of the Southeast, such as the Cherokee, they built towns along rivers and creeks, including homes and buildings from mud and wood. These towns had large public squares. They were carefully planned. They supported organized hunting and farming, very much on that sort of like cultural descendants of the Mississippians model. By the late 17th century, a band of Shawnee who controlled off and on like huge swaths of the Southeast and the Midwest, from Alabama up through Tennessee and Kentucky and Indiana and Pennsylvania and Virginia. They showed up. They managed to befriend the Westo by warning them of impending attacks by the other tribes around the Westo that they had victimized. And then this band of Shawnee came to be known as the Savannah Indians.
Hey, these guys are all right.
The Savannah, meanwhile, signed some trade treaties of their own with the Carolina colony, then sided with the colonists in a war against the Westo, sort of playing the Westo's game against them. And by 1680, the Westo were effectively extinct. So at least
this is some Game of Thrones level maneuvers.
It really is. And they were considered extinct by the end of the 17th century, but into the 18th century, according to some colonial era maps of indigenous tribes locations, there were at least a couple of Westo villages still, but the Westo basically just ceased to exist as a cultural force. And I bring this up in part to highlight that the indigenous peoples of the region were like real and complete people with complicated cultures, with positive and negative aspects, just like anybody else. Because we tend to take this very two-dimensional view of Native American people and their own history, like sort of either reducing them to powerless victims or to like cowboy movie stereotypes.
Well, right. Like I said, like the perfect example, my knee-jerk reaction to it. And then they splintered into 11 groups. I'm like, how? Right? So like, it's very easy to do that.
Totally. Like real violence and real tragedies were perpetrated against them by the colonists who arrived. But they also had their own complicated politics and their own economies and their own complicated diplomatic sphere and their own rivalries and their own crimes against each other way before folks arrived here from Europe or anywhere else. And so I think preserving their whole story is one of the best ways that we can sort of try to do better than our forebears in a lot of ways.
Yeah, otherwise
I found the story of the Westo really fascinating.
We certainly don't want to seem reductive, and it's very easy if you're not in the right headspace of thinking about the realities of the situation, what it would be like, as exampled by my pause earlier of like, wait, what? So sorry about that.
I don't know. That's great. So European colonists and arrivals began settling in modern day Union County in the 1750s, with the first settlement in the area of Browns Creek, named after the guy who lived at the head of the creek. It's just that simple.
I found this creek. It's mine.
Pretty much. That was the deal. And several congregations in the area pooled resources to build a non-denominational Protestant Christian meeting house, aka a union church.
Yeah.
That's the name of the county and the town.
Cool. That's simple enough. So far, I'm tracking. This is all making sense to me in my undercaffeinated brain. Guy named Brown finds creek. Union of people builds building for union. Name,
yes.
Town, union. Hulk-like story.
Pretty much. I'm glad that you're grokking this on the caveman level. So before we get to the ghost town of Goshen, I want to give a brief historical aside. Another one, I realize.
I don't believe you, but go ahead.
On April 20th of 1861, Union County had its first UFO event.
Ooh, all right. I'm back. I'm in.
A hot air balloon crash landed. And the people of Union County had never seen a hot air balloon before. The pilot was this guy named Professor T.S.C. Lowe, L-O-W.
Out of here. T.S.C. 3.
Let me tell you, okay, I'm sparing you the 10 minutes it would take me to read you this dude's full name. This dude had the most complicated, ridiculous, old-timey name. His name is like a joke that is at the expense of the 19th century. But he was known as Professor T.S.C. Lowe. And he's from Cincinnati, Ohio. So the night before, in Cincinnati shortly after arriving at a formal banquet honoring a friend, and thus dressed in formal evening clothes, including a silk top hat and a Prince Albert waistcoat.
Get out. Come on. He did not get in the balloon in that.
Oh, he did. He was notified as soon as he arrived at the party that winds were favorable for an experiment that he had been waiting to conduct. He wanted to prove that air currents in the atmosphere moved west to east. That's easy for us to know now because you look at a weather app. But
Right.
at the time, this was highly theoretical. And so his experiment was he wanted to go up in a balloon when the winds were favorable and prove that the wind moved west to east by flying from Cincinnati to Washington, D.C.
Okay. So bring me my top hat and put me in the balloon.
So he shows up at this party. He is dressed for a extremely elegant gala. And then one of his assistants bursts into the party and says, "Professor, the winds are right. You have to go now." So it is also worth noting, if you picture this in your mind, Lowe does not fit the stereotype of the bumbling old professor with the big, mutton chops and this weird cotton ball mop of gray hair.
Okay.
He looked, this is going to be an obscure reference potentially. Have you watched Schitt's Creek?
Yes.
He looked exactly like Mutt.
So, okay.
So he's this dashing young man
Mhm.
of 29, 30, something like that, with this big mustache and flowing locks of black hair. He is very popular and very charismatic. Add that to the mental picture.
Big League of Extraordinary Gentlemen vibes right now.
Very, 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 very big. He kind of looked like young Robert Downey Jr. So, with no time to waste on changing clothes, Lowe gathers his supplies: coffee, food, blankets, a bunch of navigational and scientific equipment for taking readings while he's up in the balloon, and a big stack of a special edition of the Cincinnati Daily Commercial newspaper printed at 3 a.m. to announce his launch, and takes off at 4 a.m. from Cincinnati on April 20th, 1861, headed for D.C. Because this was a time before we understood air currents, Lowe didn't know to account for the ways that air currents shifted in the atmosphere around mountains. So he hits the Alleghenies and gets pushed south, way off course. He floats over Virginia in time to hear them firing cannons on the night that they secede.
His timing is crap.
It's real bad. And after a 9-hour flight, he brings the balloon down in Union County, South Carolina at 1 p.m. in the afternoon in broad daylight.
Oh, hello.
Locals see him in the sky and immediately surround him as the balloon is coming down, armed and ready to kill him because they are convinced that he is either a demon or a spy.
The old demonic hot air balloon.
Right? But see, nobody had ever seen this before.
Yeah, okay. I got you. Yeah.
Nobody
You're
had
right.
any idea that this was even feasible. Hot air ballooning was so new at the time.
Hot air
Nobody
ballooning.
had figured out how to cross the Alleghenies in them. The guy flew this balloon at a height of an altitude of 24,000 feet without a pressure suit, without artificial atmosphere, nothing. It's a dude in a basket with a thermos of coffee, a blanket, and a compass. And
I choose to believe that he took a piece of cake from the party and wrapped it in wax paper and had that as well.
That's entirely feasible. So
Will there be cake on the balloon? It's a 9-hour flight. I expect there to be a meal served.
So this mob clusters around the balloon as it's coming down because they see it coming from a long way away.
Sure.
And their intention was to shoot him on sight. Apparently, the collective opinion was, let's just kill him now.
Oh, good. That's healthy.
Right. According to local legend, Lowe displayed a Masonic sign of distress, which is a thing I've read about. I've read that there are a lot of secret societies that have some sort of basically coded hand signal or code word or things like that for help me, I'm one of you.
Mm-hmm.
And so according to local legend, he gives this Masonic sign of distress, whatever that is. Some Masons in the mob that had gathered around him recognize it and convince the crowd, rather than kill him now, let's take him to town.
Bring him to the pancake breakfast.
So they take him into town, and the owner of the hotel in Unionville, the county seat, recognized Lowe from a demonstration that he had given at an exhibition in Charleston that they had both attended the year before, 1859.
Small
and
world.
Vouched for him, including giving him a room and feeding him a fine meal.
And the Masons were very disappointed because they wanted to have the balloon man as an attraction at their pancake breakfast for charity. No, we need him back.
So once this respected local who runs the hotel has vouched for him, then the locals are all like, okay, fine, we won't kill this guy. We still think he might be a northern spy, but we're not going to kill him. Instead, we'll put him on a train headed back to Cincinnati. First stop on the train from Unionville was Columbia, South Carolina. Well, word had gotten to Columbia overnight, literally. I'm imagining that there were people who rode to Columbia to say there's a northern spy in Unionville and he's coming here. You've got to do something because the people in Unionville have decided that they don't think he's a spy. At any rate, the guy gets to Columbia on the train the next day, and the mayor of Columbia, South Carolina, and the town council are there to detain him. They throw him in jail. And then they go and get the president and a bunch of faculty from what is now the University of South Carolina to come to jail and question the guy. And a bunch of them know his work. And on the basis of that questioning, they vouch for him too and say, no, this is the guy. He's the real deal. He's actually this professor.
Can I get some different clothes?
You got to think by that point, stuff is well worn.
What happened to my newspaper clippings? I want to put those in my memory book.
Well, apparently the newspapers were a big part of what saved his bacon, both in Unionville and Columbia. The fact that he had a stack of newspapers announcing his departure from Cincinnati, that was a big part of him convincing them that this was legit. So instead of jailing him as a northern spy, they let him proceed. He travels back up north. He goes to D.C. via more conventional means and presents his report on what happened to President Lincoln. And President Lincoln walks him to the War Department offices immediately from the Oval Office and says, hire this guy. He's going to start making stuff for the Army. Thus, Professor Lowe invents aerial reconnaissance using balloons and is the founder of the U.S. Army Balloon Corps, which was integral to the Union winning the Civil War, saving the nation, and eventually was the foundation for the United States Air Force.
The Balloon Corps is much smaller now. It's 2 guys and a tank of helium and some Mylar balloons in the gift shop at the base. PX.
Might be. I don't know. But I found it so fascinating that this guy, and believe it or not, this story is relevant. This guy has this as the history of what happened in this place.
Union County is where we're at, right? We've got Native American tribal conflicts to the scope of Game of Thrones, plot twists and betrayals and all that. We've got Balloon Man from Ohio who lands, makes his way north, starts the Army Balloon Corps. And we haven't even scratched the surface of the Ghost Hound yet. This is great.
So we're to the part where we talk about the Ghost Hound.
I'm just okay. I'm just tracking, just making sure I'm running on empty this morning. So, just trying to make sure I'm catching everything.
That's fair. So the Ghost Hound of Goshen Hill. Goshen Hill is a really small community in Union County. It, at the time, was a more populated community, and it sat along what was referred to as the Buncome Road, because it was the main stagecoach road that went from Charleston, South Carolina to Asheville, North Carolina, which is in Buncombe County.
Okay.
And the Buncombe Road...
I'm just laughing. Everything is right on the nose with the naming conventions.
It really is. They didn't have time to get creative. They'd killed everybody who might have longer histories. That's, So in 1855 in Goshen Hill, a guy named William Hardy owned a plantation that sat a few miles down the Old Buncome Road from Goshen Hill. In 1855, in the middle of the night, he sent an enslaved man from his plantation to get his apparent cousin-in-law. I'm guessing they were related somehow by marriage, but I'm not sure exactly how. This guy named Dr. George Douglas, who lived at a farm called the Oaks. The Oaks was this large mansion that Dr. Douglas had built upon marrying his wife, this woman named Frances Hardy. Thus, she's related to William Hardy.
Hardy boys.
Yeah, very much so. In some versions of this story, the person who fell ill and needed a doctor is Hardy himself, but in some, it's a different enslaved person on Hardy's plantation. In either case, when the enslaved man, whose name is not known, rode up on his mule at Dr. Douglas's home, the man and the mule were both visibly frightened. And in fact, Dr. Douglas heard the man's approach as the man was shouting for help as he rode in. The man described to Dr. Douglas a, quote, huge white dog with bared teeth that emerged from what is now the Ebenezer Church graveyard, which is an old historic graveyard that's kind of in dilapidated condition in the area these days. At the time, it was actively used and very maintained. The dog that appeared ran in and out of the woods along the road, keeping the same pace as the mule no matter how fast the mule went, harassing and threatening them all the way to Dr. Douglas's home, which was miles away, 3 miles away or so. On hearing the story, Dr. Douglas allows the man to stay the night and then accompanies him back to the Hardy plantation in the morning to attend to the sick person waiting for him there. And along the way, the unnamed man pointed out to Dr. Douglas all the places that the dog left the woods, threatened and harassed him and his mule, and then went back into the woods.
Saw it there, saw it there, saw it there, saw it there. I mean, I can't get a dog in the neighborhood to follow me for more than 3 houses. So it's kind of funny that.
Yeah, apparently this dog chased him, actively chased and threatened him for miles. So Dr. Douglas later reported that he did not see the ghost hound on the morning that he drove the man back to the Hardy plantation, but that he did see it in later years, and that seeing it himself caused him, quote, to give Haints new consideration.
Huh. So we got him to go from straight skeptic to possible believer.
Yeah. Then in the 1880s, a different doctor in the Goshen Hill community, Dr. Jim Cofield, reported encountering the ghost hound as he rode on horseback along the Old Buncome Road, which by then was starting to fall out of use. The area around Goshen Hill started to depopulate rapidly immediately after the Civil War, and a lot of farms and a lot of plantations became abandoned and fell into disrepair, and the place really rapidly started to turn into a ghost town. So whereas Goshen Hill had at one point been more or less a town, now it is, as we said at the beginning, referred to as a populated place.
A place to be.
But the Old Buncome Road, which also these days there is a road labeled Old Buncome Road on maps, but apparently that is not the road that was being taken at this time and was referred to it that way. These days, that road basically doesn't exist, or it is an essentially invisible trail through a national forest.
Getting a lot of parallels to the Squeaky Pines story.
It's funny you'd say that. Old Buncome Road and this region is in the Sumter National Forest. And the Sumter National Forest used to be almost exclusively farmland used to raise cotton. When the soil was depleted in the 1930s, the Roosevelt administration bought the land, established it as a national forest, and planted a forest there.
So weird. So many parallels.
Yeah. Yeah. It was a big conservation effort and very productive in that regard. Now it's well over 300,000 acres of national forest.
Demon dogs.
Right. Yeah. And demon dogs. So at the time, though, the Old Buncome Road was still sort of in use, and it was still the best way to get to Goshen Hill. And Dr. Cofield would ride the Old Buncome Road on horseback to make his rounds as a doctor. He had a dog of his own, which accompanied him on those rounds. And he said that as he made his rounds and rode that section of the road, the dog that was his own, would dash into the woods afraid all of a sudden, away from the road at a very specific point, usually Ebenezer Church graveyard, and then would continue following him, tracking him through the woods, but avoiding the road itself until they got past Dr. Douglas's old house. And then the dog would rejoin him. And he said that he didn't always know why this happened until he started to see the ghost hound of Goshen. And the ghost hound of Goshen would harass him and harass his horse. And he would have to ride at speed to try to get away from it, but he would always be able to keep up.
I hate doctors. It's like,
you kind of wonder, what's the deal? Why did this thing harass doctors almost exclusively?
I'm going to chase it. What are you going to do if you catch the doctor? I don't know. Figure it out when I get it.
And in these sightings, the ghost hound is described having shown people bared fangs and a huge menacing snarl. So it's not a friendly, happy little ghost, but people in the neighborhood, because it showed people their teeth, started calling it Happy Dog.
Okay.
Which I think is a really interesting part of it. So sightings extended past the 19th century. Sightings continued with regularity up to and including the present day. A local teenager named Barry Sanders reported in 1936.
Barry Sanders? Barry Sanders, the NFL legend?
Oh, yes, definitely him. No, not him.
Like, he might actually be able to outrun the dog on foot. So
he might.
it'd be pretty cool.
Yeah.
I was doing some off-season training and some thing. I outran it in my head. Anyway, go on. Sorry.
So Barry Sanders was this local teenager. He worked for a guy named Watt Henderson. And every Saturday night after work, he would walk home through Goshen Hill. And he claimed in the 1930s that he had seen and been chased by the ghost hound all the way from the graveyard to the edge of his own yard, at which point, when he ran into his home, the ghost hound ran around the house once and vanished. Then Nancy Roberts, who is sometimes described as the first lady of American folklore, she wrote a ton of ghost story books and things like that, set in the South and set in the Carolinas especially. She wrote in the 1980s or so that in 1967, a recent high school graduate named Jim Garrett was chased and pounced on by the ghost hound. And when he showed up at a friend's house afterwards, he had bite marks on his neck and blood running down his back.
Ugh.
And then Alan Charles, who is a professor at University of South Carolina Union, wrote in the Narrative History of Union County, South Carolina in 2014 that he had received earnest reports from his own students of encounters with the ghost hound of Goshen as recently as the early 2000s. And that these are not students who wanted their names known. They didn't want to get famous by it. They weren't even trying to particularly impress him. They just wanted him to know that, yes, it was real.
I want to take a field trip and not leave the car, but drive along the road.
Yeah. So, like I said, because of the ghost hound's prominent snarl, locals nicknamed it Happy Dog.
Mm-hmm.
And when I called the Union Museum to ask about the ghost hound of Goshen, a really nice woman named Miss Carol Willis of the museum immediately said, "Oh, you mean Happy Dog?" when I said ghost hound of Goshen Hill. She said that she and her friends, when she was young, would go out looking for him all the time on weekends. And I asked, "Did you ever see him?" And she said, "No, but we managed to scare ourselves plenty, you know."
That's half the fun.
Yeah, totally. I think that's so great. I loved that she was willing to share that with me. So the question obviously is, where did the ghost hound come from?
Yeah, like what is the story on that?
Right. Supposedly, sometime between 1850 and 1852, a traveling peddler arrived in Union County, going from farm to farm and house to house selling his wares. He brought with him a large mastiff as his companion and protector. It happened that the peddler's arrival in Union County coincided with a grisly murder in the community of Goshen Hill.
Bad timing. Bad timing.
Very bad time to be the new guy in town.
Kill the guy we don't know. Kill the guy we don't know and blame it on him.
That's exactly what the town did, supposedly. Supposedly, They said, well, there's no way any of us did this, and there's only one person here that we don't know, so let's kill him.
That's convenient.
Isn't it? A mob of vigilantes gathers. They go after the only stranger in town, the peddler. They, in some reports, give him a summary trial at best.
My
That's
cousin
like
It's like my cousin Vinny.
Yeah, it's very My Cousin Vinny. Like in the most generous versions of this part of the story, they give him a summary trial. In the least generous versions, there is no bothering to wait for that sort of thing. They take him out onto the Old Buncome Road and they hang him.
As was the style at the time.
Indeed. Supposedly in this version of the story, the peddler's mastiff tried to defend him from the mob, but the mob ran the dog off into nearby woods and then went about committing their own murder. The mastiff remained loyal, though, and returned to take up station under the peddler's body, allowing no one near it for days, threatening to attack anyone who came close for a week. And then, after a week, with no sign of how or where they went, the body and the mastiff disappeared. During that period of time, the mastiff is said to have howled piteously when it wasn't menacing people who came near the body. And supposedly, the ghost hound is that dog protecting the place where its master was murdered and still seeking revenge on the people who did it. There are versions of the story floating around now where the ghost hound first appears to the people in that mob and begins taking revenge on them. So that one by one, each of them falls ill or suffers some sort of tragedy. One has his foot bitten so badly that he limps for the rest of his life. Another has a child disappear in the section of the road where the hanging occurred, and so on, things like that. And there are also versions around now in which the peddler's crime, quote unquote, is mere petty theft. But in all of them, the people of Goshen Hill found out immediately after hanging the peddler that they were wrong. Somebody else confessed to the crime in question, whether it's murder, theft, or whatever. And they begin to hide from the rest of the people outside of Goshen Hill that this has ever happened because they're worried that they're going to face consequences themselves. And that's what the ghost hound embodies, is their fear of getting revenge taken upon them.
I like that. I like that. This is a good story.
Yeah. So the next thing that I tried to figure out was, is any of this real?
Sure. I mean, there's a lot of names. There's a lot of names and stuff.
A ton of names and dates and specific locations and all kinds of stuff. And as far as I can tell, the answer is that the peddler is not real, but the ghost hound is.
Yeah, the sightings, I feel like there's too many sightings and stuff. And like the peddler story is a good story, but if it's a big secret that they were trying to keep, I don't know how you'd find anything about it, right?
Right.
So they'd be like, put it on the record that we did this. This was his name. This is how we killed him. This is when we killed him. This is where we killed him.
Yeah.
But we didn't do any of it.
Right. So I went looking for any details I could
get the Hardy Boys on the case.
Yes, put the Hardy Boys on the case. I went looking for any details I could find about any of this. The first published account that I can find is from South Carolina Folk Tales, Stories of Animals and Supernatural Beings, which was published in 1941 by the Writers Program of the Works Project Administration in association with the University of South Carolina. That version includes Dr. Douglas's account of the unnamed enslaved man coming to get him and being chased by the ghost hound on his way, Dr. Cofield's accounts of seeing the ghost hound many times as he made his rounds, and Barry Sanders' account of being chased up to his own property.
Still my favorite.
And further, using census records and other public records, I've been able to verify Dr. Douglas existed. He's listed in the censuses from 1850, 1860, and 1870 as a planter or a farmer, but also as Dr. George Douglas with a profession of physician.
Okay.
Hardy existed. He's very real. I found photos of him. I found photos of Dr. Douglas even. Hardy, even the part where the enslaved man rides the mule and tries to get away from the ghost hound, Hardy is on record as having raised racing mules, and in fact won a race in 1842 at the racetrack in nearby Mabington.
Racing mules.
Racing mules. Yeah. Down to the mule, that part exists. Dr. Cofield existed. Again, he was very real. He lived on his brother's farm. He's listed in the census as having a profession of physician. He died of an aneurysm in the late 1880s. Barry Sanders, the local teen who worked for Watt Henderson, existed. He's described as a teen in the book, but based on census records, I actually think he was in his early 20s at the time. And his employer, Watt Henderson, existed. He ran a sawmill in Goshen Hill. Like, all of that is verifiable. So, like, all these people, their names, their locations, their professions, they all line up. And at the time this book was published, there were people around who had known them when they were alive, if they were not still alive themselves.
Okay, so I'm getting big squeaky pines mixed with the Gimghoul legends, where like there's so much concrete and there's so many influential people intertwined with it that like somebody saw something at some point.
Absolutely. That said, I can't find any record of any of the people in any of the later accounts, especially the more detailed accounts from people like Nancy Roberts. I can't find Jim Garrett, this guy in the 60s who says he was chased and pounced on and bitten. I can't find the friend that he was supposedly visiting. Neither of them exist in any census records.
Sure.
As far as I can tell, that and anything after that is an embellishment that appears in later accounts. I'm not saying Nancy Roberts made it up, but I am saying that she did teach creative writing. And
you know my stance on all this stuff. So
as far as I can tell, the stuff about the ghost town taking revenge against members of the mob that hanged its human is pure creepypasta and does not show up in anything until the 21st century.
people do that, right? They feel like they want to make the story better. Frankly, I don't think the story needs to be made better. I think it's a great story.
Yeah. So where did the peddler stuff come from? Like I said, I'm not saying anybody made it up, but I am saying maybe somebody might have heard the fairly obscure story of Professor Lowe's balloon being greeted by an angry mob eager to kill him on the spot, and either felt inspired by that or got confused, maybe got conflated, whatever, and to turn that into the story of there was a stranger in town and a mob in Goshen Hill tried to kill them. So
By that,
I feel like maybe that got stitched onto the original story of the ghost town just existing. Because like the peddler part of the story has this big banner hanging from it reading, "This is the cautionary tale portion of our story." Like, don't rush to judgment. Don't assume the worst of outsiders. Be careful where you land your balloon. And I'm always wary of that sort of thing being historical. It's just too tidy,
Right. It reads like a television script.
Yeah, very much so. It's huge Twilight Zone kind of thing. But if you take that part out and you go with the 1941 version, in which there simply is a ghost hound, there's no cautionary tale. Instead, you have consistent reports from a consistent location across many years, coming from many different types of witnesses, some of whom would have known each other, like I said, and many of whom would not. And those reports span a century and a half. And those people are all verifiably real. And that is history. So
this is great.
I really like that part of it. Also, just to note a couple of things, the Douglas family is actually featured in 3 ghost stories from Goshen Hill. In a 2007 article in Sandlapper magazine, Eleanor Wynne Foxworth writes of the ghost hound, but also a portrait of Dr. Douglas's mother-in-law is said to have sung audibly by moonlight. Yep. The portrait hung in his house, the Oaks, even after it was abandoned eventually. And in 1967, the mansion burned. But when people saw that the abandoned house is on fire, somebody was able to rush in and save this portrait.
Thank you.
And the portrait still exists and is owned by a relative who lives in Greenwood, South Carolina. And the family still maintains that it sings by moonlight.
Hello, my baby. Hello, my darling. I want to know what it sings.
Yeah, no, I like nothing I could find talked about what song it sang, but I love
from the windows to the wall.
And then another one for them is Dr. Douglas died in 1875. His wife died in the 1890s. To this day, there are reports that his ghost is seen praying over her grave, even though he predeceased her. And that's in the creepy old cemetery that the ghost hound emerges from in the stories.
I got to get a theremin for these types of things so I can be like,
that would be amazing. So a very quick what if, because I love to play that game. If I were going to use the ghost hound of Goshen Hill in a story, I would absolutely keep the part about the peddler. That is too good. Like I would want to keep that part of it, because rather than have the ghost hound be a mere canine companion, the obvious take would be to make the peddler a witch, and the mastiff is familiar. Right?
Ah, yes.
But what if it's the other way around? What if the mastiff is a shape-shifted witch and the peddler is their manservant and convenient cover for travel through the superstitious and hostile South?
What does the peddler sell? Buy your witch supply. I mean,
brooms.
Totally not witchy things. Please.
Brooms, candles, silver jewelry.
Black conical hats.
Conical hats, beer making supplies. There's a European history deep cut. So personally, I love the idea of a witch so loyal to their human familiar, quote unquote, that they stay in the town or occasionally return to it cackling astride a rough-made broom to wreak revenge on those who would dare harm their minion. I love that idea. I would so use that in a book.
That's a good story. I like that. You should do that.
So a couple of shout outs. A big shout out to the Union County Museum in Unionville, South Carolina. They were amazing. I called them, asked a couple of questions, had a great conversation. And then within an hour, they had scanned a bunch of documents and emailed them to me so that I could have some stuff to draw from. Also, a huge shout out to the State Library of North Carolina, which has a copy of South Carolina Folk Tales, which is a book that is exceptionally hard to find and is impossible to buy online for anything less than $150 or $200. So big ups to them. And that's the story.
Awesome. Well, thank you for doing all that. That was full of twists and turns and Balloon Man and Demon Dogs.
It's a real roller coaster, but I really do think that like the best explanation for how do we just stitch together, these two stories is, well, let's take the story that quote unquote nobody's ever heard of the mob greeting the balloon, and let's attach that to the other famous local legend.
This is great. I once again thank you and thank everybody for joining us. And we'll see you next time.
Yeah. Thanks for your patience in listening to me ramble about the weird history of Union County, South Carolina, and where I hope my car never breaks down.
Yeah, because apparently a lot of things go sideways there. You've been listening to Arcane Carolinas. Thanks for joining us. If you liked it, give us a rating, leave a comment. If you didn't like it, send us an email and tell us why. If you're not wrong, we'll try to fix it.
And if you're interested in award-winning speculative fiction, including science fiction, urban fantasy, and horror, find me, Michael G. Williams, at www.michaelgwilliamsbooks.com and check out Falstaff Books at falstaffbooks.com.
If you'd like to pick up some Arcane Carolinas merch, look at behind-the-scenes info, pictures, videos, stuff like that, all the things that get cut, check out arcanecarolinas.com, where you can get access to our Patreon, our Facebook, our Twitter, our Instagram, all that in one place, including the merch store. Buy a shirt.
Clothe your body.
Drape your body in our wares.
Be our living billboards.